The dusty streets of Clearwater, Montana, buzzed with the same gossip they'd been chewing on for 3 years now. Margaret Maggie O'Brien walked through the town square with her chin high, though every whispered word cut deeper than the prairie wind that whipped through her auburn hair. "There goes the wild one," Mrs. Henderson muttered to her companion, clutching her shawl tighter as if Maggie's very presence might contaminate her virtue. Still unmarried at 24. Lord knows what kind of woman refuses 3 perfectly good proposals. Maggie's boots clicked against the wooden planks of the general store's porch, each step a defiant rhythm against the symphony of judgment that followed her everywhere. She'd heard it all before. How she'd embarrassed poor Thomas Miller by rejecting his proposal in front of the entire church congregation. How she'd scandalized the town by working alongside men at the telegraph office instead of teaching school, like a proper lady should. "Afternoon, Maggie," called out Sam Peterson from behind the store counter, his voice carefully neutral. At least some folks still treated her with basic courtesy, even if their wives shot disapproving glances when they thought she wasn't looking. "Afternoon, Sam. I need supplies for the trail." She placed her list on the scarred wooden counter, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Caldwell, who was examining fabric samples nearby. "The trail?" Sam's eyebrows shot up. "You're not thinking of heading out alone again, are you? It's getting dangerous out there with all the cattle rustlers, and I can handle myself." Maggie's green eyes flashed with the fire that had earned her the reputation in the first place. "Been doing it for years now." Mrs. Caldwell couldn't contain herself any longer. "It's unnatural, I tell you, a woman gallivanting around the countryside like some kind of bandit. In my day, decent women stayed home and tended to their families." Maggie turned slowly, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. "Well, Mrs. Caldwell, in your day, decent women also had families willing to claim them. Some of us make do with what we're given." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sam hurriedly gathered Maggie's supplies, beans, hardtack, coffee, and ammunition for her Winchester rifle. The same essentials that had kept her alive during her months of wandering between towns, taking whatever honest work she could find. As she shouldered her pack and headed for the door, she nearly collided with Reverend Phillips. The elderly minister's face was etched with concern, the same expression he'd worn 3 years ago when the town had collectively decided she was beyond redemption. "Margaret, my child," he said softly, "it's not too late to change your ways. The Lord forgives all who truly repent. Perhaps if you showed more humility, more willingness to accept your place." "My place?" Maggie's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You mean silent and obedient, married to a man I don't love, pretending to be something I'm not? That's not repentance, Reverend. That's surrender." She pushed past him into the blazing afternoon sun, where her horse waited patiently at the hitching post. Apache was a sturdy Mustang she'd gentled herself, the only living thing in Clearwater that didn't judge her for her choices. His coat was the color of burnished copper, matching the defiant flame in her own hair. As she secured her supplies to the saddle, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Women peered through lace curtains, men paused in their conversations, children were hushed and hurried along by protective mothers. She was the cautionary tale they told their daughters, the example of what happened when a woman refused to bend to the will of others. But Maggie O'Brien had never learned how to bend. Her father had died when she was 16, leaving her and her mother alone on a failing homestead. When her mother passed 2 years later from consumption, Maggie had tried to make it work. She'd planted crops, tended livestock, fought off creditors with nothing but determination and her father's old rifle. The bank had eventually taken the land, but not before she'd proven she could outwork, outshoot, and outstubborn most of the men in the county. That had been her first mistake, showing she was strong instead of weak, capable instead of helpless. The marriage proposals had started coming when she moved to town and took work at the telegraph office. Good men by all accounts, but men who saw her strength as something to be tamed rather than celebrated. Thomas Miller had wanted a wife who would bear his children and keep his house. James Crawford had offered security in exchange for her complete submission. Even kindly old Mr. Walsh had proposed, promising to gentle her wild ways with patience and firm guidance. She'd turned them all down, and the town had never forgiven her for it. Now, as she swung into Apache's saddle with the fluid grace of someone born to ride, she felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle over her shoulders like a heavy coat. The trail stretched out before her, leading away from the only home she'd ever known toward an uncertain future somewhere beyond the horizon. But uncertainty was better than living a lie. "Good luck to you, Maggie O'Brien," she whispered to herself, as Apache's hooves found their rhythm on the dusty road. Behind her, Clearwater continued its daily business, already forgetting the wild woman who'd refused to be tamed. Ahead lay the vast Montana wilderness, dangerous and unforgiving but honest in its harshness. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when she finally allowed herself to look back. The town was a collection of tiny buildings, now growing smaller with each mile. Smoke rose from chimneys where families gathered for supper, where children played in yards protected by white picket fences, where women hummed lullabies to babies who would grow up knowing exactly what was expected of them. A part of her, a part she tried hard to ignore, ached for that simplicity. But Maggie O'Brien had been born with a restless spirit and a heart too big for conventional cages. She'd rather face the wilderness alone than spend her life pretending to be someone she wasn't. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she made camp beside a small creek, the sound of running water a gentle counterpoint to Apache's contented snorting as he grazed nearby. Tomorrow she would continue south toward the railroad town of Billings, where she'd heard there was work for someone with her particular skills. Telegraph operators were in high demand, and unlike the gossiping busybodies of Clearwater, railroad, men cared more about competence than reputation. She built a small fire and settled back against her saddle, her rifle within easy reach. The night was full of sounds. Coyotes calling in the distance, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through grass. It was a lonely symphony, but it was honest. Out here, she was just another traveler seeking her way in the world. Not the scandal that had to be whispered about in polite company. For the first time in months, Maggie O'Brien smiled as she drifted off to sleep under the vast Montana sky. 3 days of hard riding south brought Maggie to the outskirts of the Double Bar Ranch, though she hadn't intended to stop there. Apache had thrown a shoe 20 miles back, and the horse was favoring his left front hoof despite her attempts to ease his discomfort. When she spotted smoke rising from the ranch house chimney, she had little choice but to swallow her pride and ask for help. The Double Bar had seen better days, that much was obvious from the road. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, held up more by habit than hardware. The barn roof sagged in places, and what should have been pastures full of cattle showed only sparse grass and empty water troughs. It was the kind of place that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes running as dry as a summer creek. She was still debating whether to approach when she heard the shouting. Get back, you stubborn." The voice cut off in a string of curses that would have made her father proud. Around the side of the barn came a man battling with a massive bull that seemed determined to charge straight through a gate, instead of into the pen where it belonged. The bull was winning. Maggie dismounted quickly, pulling her rope from Apache's saddle. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the chaos, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground as the bull wheeled around for another charge. The man, tall, lean, with dark hair and sun-weathered skin, scrambled backward, his own rope tangled uselessly around his boots. "When I say move, you move," Maggie shouted, sending her lasso flying in a perfect arc that settled around the bull's massive neck. The animal jerked to a halt, more surprised than restrained, but it was enough. "Now!" The rancher didn't hesitate. He grabbed the gate and swung it wide, giving the bull a clear path into the pen. The massive animal, apparently deciding this had been his idea all along, trotted through with the dignity of royalty, granting an audience. Maggie quickly loosened her rope and coiled it, stepping well clear as the man secured the gate. For a moment they stood in silence, both breathing hard from exertion and adrenaline. Then the rancher turned to look at her properly, and Maggie felt something shift in the air between them, a recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with understanding. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice rough, with more than just dust and effort. "That bull's been making my life hell for 3 days now." He laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his weathered features. "I'm Jake Morrison, and you're right, my manners have gone to hell along with everything else around here." He gestured toward the sagging buildings and empty pastures. "Though, I'm not sure coffee and a meal is much of an improvement over bull wrestling. Maggie O'Brien." She extended her hand, and when he took it, she felt the calluses that marked him as a man who worked with his hands, fought for what he had. "And, right now, coffee sounds like heaven. My horse threw a shoe and we both need rest." Jake's gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the prairie, flicked to Apache, taking in the animal's slight favor of his left front foot. "I can fix that. Got a forge in the barn, though it's probably about as reliable as everything else around here." He paused, studying her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question, and Maggie appreciated that he didn't pry. "Traveling through. Heard there might be work in Billings. Long way to travel alone." Again, no judgment in his voice, just observation. "I manage." Jake nodded as if that settled the matter. "Well, Maggie O'Brien, who manages just fine on her own. Let's see about getting you and your horse taken care of. Least I can do after you saved me from being trampled by 2,000 pounds of bad attitude." The ranch house was as worn as the outbuildings, but it was clean and functional. Jake led her to a small kitchen where coffee indeed proved to be available, along with fresh bread and butter that tasted like luxury after 3 days of trail rations. As they ate, Maggie found herself studying her host with the same careful attention he'd shown her. Jake Morrison carried himself like a man who'd seen trouble and wasn't afraid to meet it head-on, but there was something in his eyes, a weight that spoke of losses that cut deeper than money. His clothes were mended with neat stitches, the work of someone who took care of what he had because replacing it wasn't an option. When he moved, she caught glimpses of old injuries in the careful way he favored his left side, the slight stiffness in his shoulders that spoke of pain long endured. "How long have you been fighting to keep this place?" she asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. Jake paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. 3 years. My wife died in childbirth along with the baby." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Maggie heard the carefully controlled grief beneath the words. "Lost most of the herd to disease the year after. Bank's been patient, but patience only stretches so far. I'm sorry." The words were inadequate, but they were honest. "Life happens." He set down his cup and met her eyes. "You learn to keep going or you don't. I'm not much for giving up." Maggie found herself nodding. "No, I can see that. Man who gives up doesn't spend 3 days fighting a bull that could kill him. Woman who gives up doesn't travel alone through country most men wouldn't cross without a gun crew," Jake replied with a slight smile. "Speaking of which, that was some rope work earlier. Where'd you learn to handle a lasso like that?" "My father. He said a person should know how to take care of themselves, whether they wore skirts or trousers." Maggie felt the familiar pang that always came with thoughts of her father. "He died when I was 16. Young age to lose a parent. Young age to lose anyone you love." The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying more weight than she'd intended. Jake studied her face with those storm-gray eyes, and Maggie had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight, through to all the lonely places she kept hidden. "You've had your share of losses, too." It wasn't a question, and she found herself answering with an honesty that surprised her. "My parents, our homestead, the only home I ever knew. And then..." She stopped, not ready to share the story of Clearwater and the choices that had made her an outcast. "And then you ended up on the trail alone," Jake finished quietly. "Running from something or toward something?" Maggie considered the question seriously. "Both, I think. Sometimes they're the same thing." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the coffee growing cold between them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the approaching evening. Finally, Jake pushed back from the table. Let me see about that shoe for your horse. I'll fix you up a bed in the spare room. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. He paused at the door. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. It's been nice having someone to talk to who doesn't moo or try to trample me. Maggie felt something warm unfurl in her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten existed. Thank you, Jake Morrison. I'd like that. As she watched him walk toward the barn, his shoulders set against the wind, she found herself wondering what it would be like to stop running, to have a place where she belonged. The thought was dangerous. She'd learned not to hope for things that were beyond her reach. But sitting in Jake Morrison's kitchen, listening to his honest words and seeing the way he looked at her without judgment, she couldn't quite push the hope away. Maybe, just maybe, the trail had led her exactly where she needed to be. The blacksmith work took longer than expected. Jake's forge had indeed seen better days, and what should have been a simple job of reshaping and fitting a horseshoe turned into a full afternoon of coaxing life out of reluctant equipment. Maggie found herself genuinely useful for the first time in months, holding tools, working the bellows, and offering suggestions born from years of helping her father with similar repairs. You weren't raised to be a parlor decoration, were you? Jake asked, as she expertly judged the heat of the iron by its color, something most town-bred women would never have learned. My father believed in practical education, Maggie replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Said the world was hard enough without handicapping yourself with ignorance. Jake nodded approvingly as he shaped the hot metal. Smart man. My father had similar ideas, though he probably never imagined his son would end up grateful for a woman who knew the difference between cherry red and white hot iron. They worked in comfortable rhythm, the kind of wordless cooperation that usually took years to develop. When Apache's shoe was finally fitted and nailed properly, they stood back to admire their work with the satisfaction of a job well done. The horse tested his weight on the hoof and snorted his approval. He's got good sense, Jake observed, patting Apache's neck. Horse that'll trust a stranger to work on him usually trusts the person who rides him too. Apache and I understand each other, Maggie said, running her hand along the horse's shoulder. We're both too stubborn to quit and too smart to trust easily. Good qualities in dangerous country. Jake was studying her again with that unsettling intensity. You planning to keep moving tomorrow? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Maggie found herself torn between the safety of movement and the dangerous temptation of staying in one place long enough to matter to someone again. I should, she said finally. No point in wearing out my welcome. What if you're not? Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but something in his eyes made Maggie's heart skip a beat. Wearing out your welcome, I mean. What if... The sound of approaching horses cut him off. Multiple riders moving fast and with purpose. Jake's expression darkened as he stepped to the barn door and peered out toward the main road. Trouble? Maggie asked, moving to stand beside him. Probably. His jaw was tight. That's Sheriff Brennan and half the town council. They don't make social calls out here. Maggie felt her stomach drop as she recognized the implication. They're looking for someone. Jake's eyes flicked to her, and she saw the moment understanding dawned. They're looking for you. The riders were close enough now to make out individual faces, and Maggie's heart sank as she recognized Thomas Miller among them. Thomas, whose marriage proposal she'd rejected 3 years ago, whose pride had never recovered from the public humiliation. Beside him rode his brother-in-law, Sheriff Brennan, a man who'd made his feelings about unnatural women abundantly clear over the years. Miss O'Brien. Sheriff Brennan's voice carried clearly across the yard as the group reined in near the house. We need to have a word with you. Jake stepped, slightly in front of Maggie, a gesture so natural she wondered if he even realized he'd done it. Sheriff, what brings you all the way out to my place? Official business, Morrison. We've had reports of cattle theft in the area, and Miss O'Brien was seen heading this direction. Brennan's tone was formal, but Maggie could hear the satisfaction underneath. We need to search her belongings. Cattle theft? Maggie stepped forward, her temper flaring. That's ridiculous, and you know it. I've been on the trail for 3 days, and I haven't seen any cattle except the bull Jake was working with when I arrived. Thomas Miller finally spoke, his voice tight with old anger. Convenient story, but then you always were good with stories. Weren't you, Maggie? Always had an excuse for why you couldn't be what decent folks expected. The accusation hit like a physical blow, but it was Jake's reaction that surprised her. He moved forward until he was standing between her and the mounted men, his posture radiating controlled aggression. That's enough. His voice was deadly quiet. You want to make accusations on my property, you better have evidence to back them up. Morrison, I'd advise you not to get involved in this, Sheriff Brennan warned. The woman's got a reputation for leading men astray. Best you stay clear of whatever trouble she's brought with her. The only trouble I see, Jake replied evenly, is a bunch of men with nothing better to do than harass a woman traveling alone. Miss O'Brien's been here, working alongside me for the better part of the day. I can account for her time and I can vouch for her character. The words hit Maggie like a thunderbolt. No one had vouched for her character in 3 years. No one had stood up for her, defended her, or suggested she might be worth protecting. The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that she felt tears, threatened for the first time since leaving Clearwater. You don't know what you're dealing with, Morrison, Thomas said, his face flushed with anger. She's poison. Refused every decent man who ever offered for her, scandalizing the whole county with her wild ways. Now she's probably turned to thievery to support herself. What I know, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, is that she saved me from being trampled by a bull this morning, worked beside me all afternoon without complaint, and showed more skill and honor in a few hours than some folks manage in a lifetime. His gray eyes were storm-dark now. Dangerous. So you can take your accusations and your small-minded gossip and get off my land. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Sheriff Brennan's hand had moved to rest on his gun butt, and Maggie could see the calculation in his eyes. How far he was willing to push this, how much trouble he was prepared to cause. Finally, Thomas Miller broke the standoff. This isn't over, Maggie. You can't run forever, and you can't keep decent folks from knowing what you really are. And what's that? Jake's voice was soft, but it carried clearly in the still air. Thomas's smile was ugly. A woman too wild to be trusted, too proud to be tamed, and too damaged to be wanted by any man with sense. The words hung in the air like poison, and Maggie felt the familiar shame wash over her, the weight of years of whispered accusations and public judgment. She was dimly aware of Jake moving beside her, his whole body coiled with barely contained fury, but before he could speak, she found her own voice. You're right, Thomas. Her words surprised everyone, including herself. I am too wild to be trusted with your narrow little ideas of what a woman should be. I am too proud to be tamed into something I'm not, and I am too damaged by years of your cruelty to care what you think of me anymore. She stepped forward, her chin high and her green eyes blazing. But I'm also too smart to believe that your opinion defines my worth, and too strong to let you, or anyone else, decide my fate. So yes, I'm all of those things you say I am. And I'm proud of every single one of them. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Jake moved to stand beside her, not in front of her this time, but next to her, an equal and ally. Sheriff, he said quietly, unless you have an actual warrant or evidence of wrongdoing, I believe you gentlemen should be moving along. The lady and I have work to finish before dark. Sheriff Brennan looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Jake's manner convinced him otherwise. With muttered threats about keeping an eye on things, the group wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving dust and tension in their wake. When they were gone, Maggie found herself shaking, not with fear, but with the aftermath of adrenaline and emotion. Jake reached out tentatively, his hand hovering near her shoulder. You all right? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Then, surprising herself, she turned to face him fully. Thank you for defending me. No one's done that in a very long time. They were wrong, Jake said simply, about all of it. You're not poison and you're not damaged goods. You're just... He paused, searching for words. You're just yourself. and that's more than enough. Standing there in the fading light, looking into Jake Morrison's honest gray eyes, Maggie felt something she'd thought was lost forever. The possibility of being known, truly known, and accepted anyway. It was terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Jake," she said softly, "there's something you should know. About why they really came here. About what I'm really running from." He waited, patient as stone, while she gathered the courage to speak the truth she'd been carrying alone for 3 years. "I'm not running from cattle theft or scandal," she said finally. "I'm running from the truth about who I really am. And if you really knew, try me," Jake said quietly. "I've got a feeling I'm harder to shock than most folks." And looking into his storm gray eyes, seeing the steady strength that had defended her against her accusers, Maggie O'Brien finally found the courage to stop running from the truth. The confession came in halting whispers as they sat by the kitchen fire. The weight of 3 years' silence finally too heavy to bear alone. Maggie told Jake about the night that changed everything. The night she'd discovered her mother's journal hidden in the bottom of an old trunk, pages filled with secrets that shattered everything she'd believed about herself. My father, she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. My mother, she'd been promised to another man, arranged by her family back east. But she fell in love with a drifter, a man passing through who promised her freedom and adventure. Maggie's hands twisted in her lap. When she discovered she was carrying his child, he was already gone, moved on to whatever was beyond the horizon. Jake listened without judgment, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she paused, struggling with the words, he simply waited, offering her the gift of patience. My mother married the man she was supposed to, Patrick O'Brien. He was good to her, to me. Raised me as his own, never let on that I wasn't his blood. But after they both died, I found the letters. Her voice broke slightly. Letters from my real father, promises he never kept, explanations for why he couldn't stay. And the town found out, Jake said quietly. It wasn't a question. Maggie nodded miserably. Mrs. Caldwell was helping me go through my mother's things. She saw the journal, read just enough to piece together the truth. Within a week, everyone in Clearwater knew that Margaret O'Brien was a bastard child, born of sin and abandonment. She looked up at Jake, expecting to see the familiar mixture of pity and disgust she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she found only understanding. That's why they really call me too wild to wed. It's not just my behavior, it's my blood. Bad blood, they say. The kind that breeds more sin and shame. The fire popped and hissed in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with the promise of a coming storm. Finally, Jake spoke. You know what I think about bad blood? His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. I think it's horse shit. The blunt profanity startled a laugh out of Maggie despite her tears. Jake Morrison, what would your mother say about language like that? She'd probably agree with me, Jake replied with a slight smile. My mother was a practical woman. She judged people by what they did, not where they came from. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Maggie, I've known you for less than 2 days. But in that time, I've seen you risk yourself to help a stranger, work alongside me without complaint, face down armed men with more courage than they deserved, and tell me the truth even though it scared you. That's not bad blood talking. That's good character. The whole town is full of people who need someone to look down on so they can feel better about their own small lives. Jake interrupted firmly. They've decided you're convenient for that purpose. So they've convinced themselves you're everything they say you are. But I'm looking at you right now, Maggie O'Brien, and I see a woman worth knowing, worth defending, and worth... He stopped himself, color rising in his weathered cheeks. Worth what? Maggie asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jake stood abruptly, running a hand through his dark hair. Worth more than a broken-down rancher with more debts than cattle and a reputation for poor judgment. Jake Morrison, Maggie said, rising to face him, are you suggesting that your judgment is poor for seeing something good in me? I'm suggesting, Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion, that I'm starting to care about you more than is probably wise, considering I've got nothing to offer but a failing ranch and the promise of a hard life. The words hung between them, honest and raw as an open wound. Maggie felt her breath catch in her throat, hope and fear warring in her chest. And I'm suggesting, she said softly, that maybe we're both tired of being alone. The storm broke, just as Jake reached for her, rain lashing against the windows with sudden fury. But inside the small kitchen, wrapped in Jake Morrison's arms for the first time in her life, Maggie O'Brien felt perfectly safe. His kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he expected her to pull away. When she didn't, when she kissed him, "They'll never accept it," she whispered back, though she made no move to leave his embrace. The bank, the townspeople, everyone who matters for keeping this ranch running. They'll make life impossible for you if you choose me. Then we'll make our own life, Jake said fiercely. We'll fight for this place together, and if we lose it, we'll find another. But I'm done pretending I don't want things I can't have, and I'm done letting other people decide what I deserve. The storm raged outside, but neither of them noticed. They had found something worth sheltering, worth protecting, worth fighting, and for the first time in 3 years, Maggie O'Brien wasn't running towards something or away from it. She was standing still, grounded by the steady strength of the man who held her and the promise of a future she'd never dared to imagine. 8 years. Next morning brought sunshine and the sound of approaching riders. But this time, Jake and Maggie met them together, standing side by side on the porch of the Double Bar Ranch. Sheriff Brennan was back, along with Thomas Miller and several other men from Clearwater, their faces grim with purpose. "Miss O'Brien," Brennan called out, "we're here to escort you back to town. There are questions that need answering." "The lady's not going anywhere," Jake replied calmly. "And before you start making more accusations, you should know that we're engaged to be married. Maggie's going to be my wife, which makes her my responsibility and my protection." The announcement hit the group like a thunderbolt. Thomas Miller's face went white, then red with fury. "Morrison, you can't be serious. You don't know what she is." "I know exactly what she is," Jake interrupted. "She's the woman I love, the partner I choose, and the future I want. And if you've got a problem with that, you can take it up with me directly." "The bank won't stand for this," another voice called out. Mr. Whitman, who held the note on Jake's property. "A man in your position can't afford to make enemies, Morrison. Choose wisely." Jake's smile was sharp as a blade. "I am choosing wisely. I'm choosing the woman who's strong enough to help me save this ranch, smart enough to see it through the hard times ahead, and brave enough to stand beside me no matter what comes." He looked directly at Thomas Miller. "I'm choosing a partner, not a decoration. A woman who will work beside me, not behind me. And I'm choosing love over convenience, which I suspect is something foreign to most of you gentlemen." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. She stepped forward, taking Jake's hand in hers. "And I'm choosing a man who sees my strength as a gift instead of a threat, who values my mind as much as my heart, and who's willing to face the whole world if necessary to defend what we're building together." The standoff stretched taut, but this time it was the riders who backed down. Sheriff Brennan looked like he wanted to argue, but even he could see the futility of it. Thomas Miller wheeled his horse around without another word, his dreams of revenge crumbling in the face of something he'd never understood: genuine love and acceptance. As the group rode away, Jake squeezed Maggie's hand. "No regrets?" "Only one," she said, rising up on her toes to kiss him soundly. "I regret waiting so long to find you." The wedding took place a month later in the small church in Billings, far from the gossips and small minds of Clearwater. Maggie wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her taller frame, and Jake wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that matched the ones in her hair. The congregation was small: a few neighboring ranchers, the telegraph office workers who'd come to respect Maggie's skills, and the minister who'd agreed to perform the ceremony without asking uncomfortable questions about bloodlines or reputations. But As Jake Morrison took Margaret O'Brien as his lawfully wedded wife, promising to love and cherish her for all their days, the small crowd didn't matter. What mattered was the look in his eyes, the steadiness of his voice, and the way their hands fit together, as if they'd been crafted for exactly this moment. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a smile. And Jake Morrison did, thoroughly and completely, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of passion, partnership, and the unshakable certainty that some things were worth fighting for. The years that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. The Double Bar Ranch slowly began to thrive under the combined efforts of Jake's determination and Maggie's fierce intelligence. She proved as skilled with ledgers as she was with livestock, finding ways to stretch every dollar and maximize every opportunity. When the bank tried to foreclose during a particularly harsh winter, it was Maggie who rode to Billings and negotiated new terms, her sharp mind and sharper tongue convincing the bankers that the Morrison Ranch was a better investment than they'd realized. The townspeople of Clearwater eventually learned to keep their opinions to themselves. Word spread of the wild woman who'd helped turn a failing ranch into one of the most profitable spreads in the county, and even the most stubborn. Gossips had to admit that perhaps there was more to Margaret Morrison than scandal and shame. Thomas Miller moved back east, unable to stomach the sight of Maggie's success, but most folks gradually accepted what Jake had seen from the beginning, that strength and independence weren't flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be celebrated. Their 5th wedding anniversary, Jake surprised Maggie with a gift that left her speechless. It was a deed, not to more land, but to the original O'Brien homestead where she'd been born. He'd quietly bought it back from the bank, restored the old house, and turned it into a sanctuary for other women like her, those who'd been cast out, labeled as too much or not enough by a world that couldn't see their worth. "Every woman deserves a place where she can be herself," Jake said as they stood on the porch of her childhood home, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. "A place where her strength is valued, her voice is heard, and her heart is safe." Maggie leaned against her husband's solid warmth, watching Apache graze in the pasture where her father had once taught her to rope and ride. Their own children played in the yard, 3 strong, wild-hearted youngsters who were learning that love came without conditions, and that worth was something you carried inside yourself, not something others bestowed upon you. "Jake Morrison," she said softly, "do you ever regret marrying the woman who was too wild to wed?" His arms tightened around her and she felt his smile against her hair. "Every single day," he replied solemnly. Then his voice turned warm with laughter. "I regret that I wasted so much time before I found her, and I regret that there aren't more hours in the day to love her properly." As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Margaret Morrison, once the outcast of Clearwater, now the beloved wife of Jake Morrison and the mother of 3 remarkable children, finally understood what her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. A person's worth wasn't determined by the circumstances of their birth or the opinions of narrow-minded people. It was determined by the choices they made, the love they shared, and the courage they showed in the face of a world that sometimes forgot that different didn't mean wrong. She was still wild, still untamable in all the ways that mattered, but she was no longer alone. She had found her place beside a man who celebrated her strength instead of trying to diminish it, who saw her independence as a gift to their partnership rather than a threat to his authority. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate struggles, a love that was strong enough to weather any storm, a family that thrived on authenticity rather than pretense, and a legacy that would teach future generations that true love wasn't about changing someone into what you wanted them to be. It was about loving them exactly as they were, wild heart and all. In the end, Margaret O'Brien Morrison had never been too wild to wed. She had simply been waiting for a man brave enough to ride beside her instead of trying to rein her in. And in Jake Morrison, she had found not just a husband, but a true partner in every sense of the word. Someone who understood that the wildest hearts often love the deepest, and that a woman who refuses to be tamed is exactly the kind of woman worth building a life with. Their story became legend in the territory, told around campfires and repeated in saloons from Montana to Texas. It was a story of redemption and recognition, of love that conquered prejudice and partnership that transformed two struggling souls into an unstoppable force. But most of all, it was a story of hope, proof that somewhere in the vast wilderness of the world there was a place for everyone, even those who had been labeled as too much, too different, or too wild to belong. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, that place was right beside someone who saw your wildness not as something to be conquered, but as something to be cherished, protected, and loved with a devotion as endless as the Montana sky. Years later, when visitors came to the Double Bar Ranch and marveled at its success, they would often ask Jake Morrison what his secret was. He would smile, his weathered hand finding his wife's as naturally as breathing, and give the same answer every time. I married a woman they said was too wild to wed. Turns out she was exactly wild enough to build a life worth living. And Maggie Morrison, her auburn hair now streaked with silver but her green eyes still blazing with the fire that had once scandalized an entire town, would laugh and add, "Sometimes the best things in life are the ones everyone else is too afraid to claim." Together they had proven that love didn't require conformity, that strength was meant to be shared, and that the wildest hearts, when given room to flourish, could create something more beautiful than anyone had ever dared to imagine. In the end, she had never needed to be tamed. She had simply needed to be understood, accepted, and loved exactly as she was, wild, wonderful, and absolutely worth the wait.